Henry Ford and Alfred P. Sloan.
In the last several lectures, I've been talking in one form or another about the Industrial Revolution that occurred in the United States in the 19th century. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about another kind of revolution, a revolution that was equally sweeping. And there's no better way of describing it than the automobile revolution. If you consider 20th century American life, there's nothing that characterizes American life better than the automobile. In fact, if you look at the structure of modern American cities, cities that were built in the 20th century or largely grew in the 20th century, they are quite distinct in terms of their general layout, their overall appearance, their livability from cities that were built earlier. If you look at American cities compared to European cities or Asian cities, the distinction is quite marked. America is the land of the automobile, and it's been that way for the last 100 years. Now, this is an aside, but one of the things that's really interesting to consider is, well, we're about 100 years into the age of the automobile, but one of the remarkable things is how little the automobile has changed in those 100 years. We could talk about that some more, but if you think about it for a minute, well, I'll just relate an issue from my personal experience. When I was a kid, growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s, I used to read Popular Mechanics magazine. It was one of my favorites. And about every couple of years, on the cover of Popular Mechanics magazine, there would be an artist rendering of your own personal airplane, or they would call it your hovercraft or something. There was this notion that, okay, we're 50 years into the automobile age. What is the next big thing in private transportation? Well, everybody thought it would be flying. And I can remember thinking what a wonderful thing that would be, to be able to get into my own private airplane and fly here, there, anywhere. Sometimes it looked like a jetpack, sometimes it looked like a little helicopter, but in any event, that's the way you go. It didn't happen. We're still waiting for that personal flying vehicle. While we live in the age of the automobile. The automobile is going as strong today as it was 100 years ago. So it's worth devoting a lecture to the two individuals in American business and economic history who did more to put Americans on wheels than anyone else. And these two individuals are Henry Ford and Alfred P. Sloan. I'll start with Henry Ford because Henry Ford was the person who really, more than anybody else, put America on wheels. Henry Ford was a visionary. Henry Ford was a revolutionary. Henry Ford envisioned a world where Americans would have a personal kind of mobility that until that time had been reserved only to the wealthy. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, although very many Americans, very many people around the world may be forgiven for thinking he did. The automobile had been around in one form or another since really the 1880s or 1890s. People had been tinkering with the idea of motorizing a vehicle for individuals. It was a natural progression from railroads, where you put a steam engine on board this big thing to haul a train. Well, there had been wagons and buggies and the like for hundreds of years. So it occurred to some people, why don't we put a steam engine on one of those? And people began trying to do it. It was a problem at first because steam engines tend to be rather heavy and bulky and noisy and loud and sometimes dangerous. But there was no lack of tinkerers to try to make this conversion. And so the conversion was made, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It was really in the 1890s when people discovered the principle of the internal combustion engine. Instead of a steam engine, which requires a boiler and a separate piston arrangement, in an internal combustion engine, the combustion takes place within the pistons. So you get much more power for much less weight. And these were first devised in the 1890s. These made possible the automobile as we know it. Henry Ford was just growing up at this point, and he saw some of the early automobiles and their farm equivalents. And he decided that this was where he was going to devote the energies of his life. He had been a tinkerer. He had worked in blacksmith shops. He had taken apart watches. He prided himself at the age of 15 at being able to fix and repair any sort of watch that came into his hands. He always liked to take things apart. And interestingly, Henry Ford was not especially well educated in the formal sense, and maybe more than many American entrepreneurs, but certainly like many American entrepreneurs, Henry Ford developed what only can be described as a certain anti-intellectual strain. He believed that in many cases Americans were overeducated in a formal sense. He distrusted engineers, for example. He thought a person could learn much more by taking machines apart and putting them back together than by studying any course of theoretical engineering. So he always considered himself a nuts and bolts guy, up to his elbows in grease and grime sort of fellow. And so when he went into the automobile business, this was the attitude that he took, that the way to develop an automobile was to get in there and work and tinker and improve the machine yourself. There was something else he brought to the automobile industry, and that was an abiding sense of democracy. Not so much in a political sense. Henry Ford later went into politics with more or less disastrous results. But he had this democratic sense. You might call it a belief in economic democracy. That at a time when J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford came on the scene just as J.P. Morgan was achieving his enormous control over American finance. Henry Ford grew up against that background. He grew up in an age when Andrew Carnegie was still making steel and John D. Rockefeller had the world petroleum industry by the throat. And Henry Ford, like very many people of his day, believed that all that centralized economic power was a bad thing for America. It was bad for consumers. It was bad for the performance of the economy as a whole. It was bad for the relationship between individuals and the economy and government. Again, this question, what's the role of government and private enterprise? Ford's vision was not to take on J.P. Morgan and the like through regulation, not to go the political route, but was to launch what we could really call a democratic revolution in business. And his revolution was going to make ordinary people the equal of the wealthiest in terms of their ability to get around. Now, in Ford's day, when Ford first entered the scene, this is right at the beginning of the 20th century. So Ford puts out his first automobile in 1903, so right at the beginning of the 20th century. The automobile industry was producing cars, but a very small number of cars. And these were cars that were targeted at the very wealthy. In fact, there were some people who, even in those days, were trying to assess what the future of the American automobile industry was. And the general feeling was that automobile sales were restricted by the number of people who could afford to pay chauffeurs. Because everybody who had a car had a chauffeur. And, unless you could afford a chauffeur, you couldn't afford a car. And Ford recognized that if you look at it that way, you really do limit how many cars you can sell because there aren't that many wealthy people. But he saw that there were plenty of people who would be happy to drive their own cars if they could simply afford them. So his idea was to make a car that ordinary folks could buy. He was going to put America on wheels. Now, he began this simply by tinkering and building his own car. It's a novel concept 100 years later. If somebody thinks about building a car, these days they typically don't go out in the garage or don't go out in the shed and build a car. But in Ford's day, somebody like Henry Ford could and did. His first car was a little bit of an embarrassment because Ford, sometimes he could be that absent-minded inventor type. He built this car in a shed and had the thing completed before he realized that the door to the shed was too small for the car to get out. And so he had to take an axe and chop out the sides of the wall to make it bigger so he could get his car out. When he got it out, it was a great hit. He grew up in Dearborn, Michigan, close to Detroit. And everybody in the area thought that this was a great thing. In fact, he used to have to chain it to trees and the like, the way people have to lock up their bicycles these days, because it didn't have the kind of keyed ignition switch and like, and people always wanted to get on and start driving it off. But he realized he was on to something when he discovered that he could sell it for $200 and make back his investment. Now, this was far below the ordinary price of automobiles in those days, which was in the thousands. So Ford figured if he could make some improvements, then he could have a car that all sorts of people would purchase. In those days, as now, one of the things that people liked about automobiles was the idea that they could go fast. Fast was a relative term. And in some places, actually, first I have to hark back to the days of the railroads. In the days of the railroads, there was some fear that the human body simply could not stand speeds in excess of 20 miles an hour. And so the early trains wouldn't go any faster than that for fear that people who were riding would simply fall to pieces. Now, by the late 19th century, trains were going at a fairly high rate of speed, and people discovered that speed alone didn't mean the death to the riders or the drivers. But nonetheless, Henry Ford decided that if he was going to make a name for his car, he needed to show that it had performance. It could go. So he built a couple of cars, actually, that he entered in automobile races. And one of the cars was called the 999. Exactly why, I don't know. The other was called the Arrow for obvious reasons. It sounds fast. But anyway, Henry Ford decided that he was going to build this car that would really go. And here he's describing his reasoning as he built this car that was going to be known for speed. I'm quoting Henry Ford here. Quote, "If an automobile were going to be known for speed, then I was going to make an automobile that would be known wherever speed was known. I put in 4 great big cylinders giving 80 horsepower, which up to that time had been unheard of. The roar of those cylinders alone was enough to half kill a man. There was only one seat. One life to a car was enough, I thought. I tried out the cars. I cannot quite describe the sensation. Going over Niagara Falls would have been but a pastime after a ride in one of those." Now, if you think about it, it's amazing because cars in those days could travel easily 60 miles an hour. In a fairly short time, they were getting up over 100 miles an hour, which is quite respectable even for cars these days. But Ford recognized that speed was what would sell the cars, at least draw attention to the cars, but what really was going to bring customers into his factory, into his store, was to build cars that would be relatively cheap. A car for the multitude, not a car for the classes, but a car for the masses. Now, here's Ford describing his philosophy regarding building cars generally. And I quote Ford, quote, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials, by the best men to be hired, after, and this is the important part, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise. But it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one, and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." Now, I suppose it's only in America that one could talk about those great open spaces. Imagine a Ford transported to France. Well, there really weren't those kind of great open spaces. And furthermore, there wasn't that tradition of the open sense of the frontier and of endless possibility. In the United States, geography has often been very closely wrapped up in American mythology and America's self-conception. And so I think that's very important in why it is that America identifies so early and so firmly with the automobile, because it provides the kind of freedom that Americans have often cherished. Again, I go back to the promise of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Well, the automobile is Henry Ford's Declaration of Independence, not political independence, but economic, social independence. Now, once he had come up with his philosophy or his overall strategy, he had to come up with his tactics, his means of putting his philosophy into practice. And now I'll continue with what Henry Ford describes, what he was going to do. Quote, "The way to make automobiles is to make one automobile like another automobile, to make them all alike, to make them come through the factory just alike, just as one pin is like another pin when it comes from a pin factory, or one match is like another match when it comes from a match factory. Henry Ford was not especially well educated. I mentioned this earlier, but I mention it at this point because I have no way of knowing whether Henry Ford ever read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But one of the most famous example that Adam Smith mentions in the Wealth of Nations is the pin factory, where he's talking about the value of the separation of various production process and specialization, and why he talks about if one person is trying to make pins and has to do every procedure by himself, then this one person can maybe make a dozen pins a day. But if one pursues what Smith called the division of labor, then you get several people all trained in their own methods. They can make thousands of pins a day. I don't know if Henry Ford had this model consciously in mind when he talks about pins coming from a pin factory, but that's exactly what he did. He's using the principles that Adam Smith described in The Wealth of Nations and applying them to automobiles. He was also using principles that went back in an American context to Eli Whitney, the person who invented the cotton gin. In another context, Eli Whitney pioneered the use of interchangeable parts in the production of guns. Now, this is critical because most machines, up until Ford's day, and especially up until Eli Whitney's day at the beginning of the 19th century, were made one at a time, where all the parts were made to fit. They were custom made. They were like hand-tailored suits. When Whitney came along, he arranged for all of the different parts to be made to match specifications. So there was one person that would make this particular part of the gun, another person who would make the barrel of the gun, another person would make the handle of the gun, and they'd all be just alike, so they would all fit one with the other. Ford applies this idea to the making of automobiles. Until this time, automobiles had been like tailored suits. You make one car and you sell it. You make the next car and you sell it. And the parts, because many of the parts are handcrafted, the parts would just fit this car. If something broke down, you couldn't simply go to an auto mechanic and buy a part off the shelf. You had to go to somebody who could actually make the parts himself. Henry Ford's vision, his breakthrough, was that the cars could be produced cheaply if they were all made alike, one after the other. The embodiment of Henry Ford's vision, of his dream, was the Model T. The first Model T rolled out of the Ford factory in 1903. And it kept rolling out and rolling out and rolling out for 25 years. Ford recognized that one of the major expenses of producing an automobile was producing the first one, to make the model that everything else was going to be based on, of establishing the assembly lines, of getting the factory up and running. He understood that if you could make the production lines go longer and longer, that the millionth Model T would in effect cost a whole lot less than the first one, and the 10 millionth Model T would cost much less than that. So Ford pioneered the assembly line, which was based on interchangeable parts, but it was also based on, now this is something that Ford says, he got the idea from Chicago meat packing plants. Until now, even with interchangeable parts, typically the object that was being made was still, and the people moved around it. What Ford did was to put the object being built, the car, on a moving assembly line. The workers stayed still and the car moved past them. When Ford's production plant at Highland Park in Michigan got up and running, these cars just came off this conveyor belt and they began pouring out of Ford's factory at a rate that put to shame all the other automobile producers until then. The first cars that came out sold for a little over $800. This was lower than most cars of its day, but it wasn't enough to accomplish the revolution that Ford wanted, because $800 was still pretty steep by the standards of the ordinary person. So what he did was to focus on building more and more cars according to the same model. Now, the famous statement of Ford regarding the fact that all the Model Ts were going to be alike. His famous statement was, the cars all came out black. And somebody said, well, can I have a red car? Can I have a color of another car? And Ford said that any customer can have a car painted any color he wants so long as it's black. Well, this is his way of saying, I'm going to make the cars, you buy what I make. But it was what allowed Ford to make cars at prices that kept falling and falling and falling. The first cars cost over $800. By the millionth car, which came off the line in 1916, they were selling for as little as $360. Now, Ford recognized that for each $50 he could lower the price, he could increase the market for his cars by tens of thousands. And this was one of Ford's revolutionary insights. If you produce the same thing over and over again, then you can lower the costs and you can increase the market. You can increase the number of people who can buy it. But there was something else that Ford recognized that was equally revolutionary and that spread beyond the automobile industry. In 1914, Ford did something that was absolutely counterintuitive by the thinking of most American industrialists. Until Ford came along, the main thing that American industrialist management tried to do was to lower the cost of production, to drive down wages. The belief was that since profits represent the difference between costs and revenues, you can increase profits by increasing revenues or by lowering costs. And so the industrialists were always trying to lower costs. Ford said, what happens if we increase, not decrease, but increase the wages we pay to our workers? Well, he had a problem until now. There's a lot of turnover in his factories. So he said, how do we reduce turnover? How do we keep people from quitting? Well, one way to do it is pay them more money. So Ford thought about it for a minute, and he realized that this could be, instead of a necessary evil, this could be a positive good. His reasoning went like this. By 1914, Ford had sold pretty much all the cars it could expect to sell to what might have been called the pre-existing market for cars. Until then, the people who worked in automobile factories could never hope to buy the cars they built because they simply didn't make enough money. Ford recognized as long as that was true and extrapolated across the economy, then there was going to be a real ceiling on how many cars he could sell. But what he said is, what if we pay our workers enough so that they can purchase our cars? And again, extrapolate this across the economy. If ordinary factory workers can buy cars, then all of a sudden you've expanded the potential customer base for your cars by a tremendous amount. So it was almost on a dare that Ford said, all right, we're going to double the wages of our workers, which until then was about $2.50 a day. He said, let's double it. Let's make it $5 a day. It was a sensation. Overnight, Ford became the best place in America to work. He was paying twice the wages of everybody else. By the way, his fellow industrialists cursed him under their breath and not always under their breath. Ford is ruining the market by giving workers the notions that they're worth $5 a day. But Ford's insight was that America could never really become great economically as long as it had this distinction between workers and consumers, between the people who produced and the people who consumed. Ford's insight was these two groups have to be the same. Our workers have to be our consumers. And the only way we can do that is to pay them enough to be our consumers. So, until Ford came along, the model for all industrial economies was we're going to be low-wage, high-price economies. That was the ideal. Keep wages low and prices up. What Ford said is, no, this economy is going to be a high-wage, high-price economy. That way we can spread the wealth to everybody. It was an expansion of his idea of economic democracy, that everybody would be able to drive a car. Now he expands it even further. And it was revolutionary. So that by 1920, millions of people were driving Ford Model Ts. But there was a problem. Or to put it another way, every revolution has a way of devouring its young. And quite typically, last year's revolutionaries become the conservatives of this year. You can see it in political revolutions. The French Revolution was almost literal in this sense, that the early revolutionaries were the ones who ended up on the guillotine. Okay, nobody chopped off Henry Ford's head. But Henry Ford discovered something. What he discovered was that once he sold his cars to pretty much everybody who could conceivably buy them, they were so well built, they were so durable, that people didn't have to buy any more cars. Basically, he had saturated his market, and therefore he was limiting the number of sales. Over the years, the number of people buying Model Ts began to decrease. Why? Because everybody had a Model T, and they weren't wearing out. This was where Alfred P. Sloan came in. Alfred P. Sloan was not an inventor. He was not even an entrepreneur in the sense of Henry Ford. He was a manager. You might say that Alfred P. Sloan represented the mature automobile industry. Henry Ford was the pioneer, the revolutionary. He was the one who created the modern automobile industry. Alfred P. Sloan brought it to maturity. Sloan became the chairman of General Motors. General Motors was one of Ford's competitors. And for a long time, it was running a sorry second place to Ford Motor. But then Ford began running into this problem that people had his car and didn't need another one. What Sloan recognized was people had to be given a reason to buy their second car. Well, they weren't going to buy their second car as long as the first one was running fine if the only reason they purchased a car, the primary reason, was on its ability to keep running. What Sloan understood was there are other values that people might consider when purchasing a car. Sloan thought about fashion, thought about clothing. And he noted, for example, that this particularly applied to women, to some degree to men, but not quite so much for whatever reasons, that very many women would buy new dresses even when, as their husbands often pointed out to them, hey, your old dress isn't worn out yet. It still looks fine, but no, they have to have a new dress, okay? Sloan thought, well, what if we apply that thinking to automobiles? After all, one could argue, by the way, maybe, for all I know, the wives were saying this to their husbands. What do you need a new car for? The old one's still running fine. But Sloan got them to say, well, I've got to have a new car. What Sloan realized was that people could come to identify themselves in some way with their cars. The car became a statement about their position in life, for example. And if a person were a success, he wouldn't be caught driving some old car. He wanted the world to know he was doing well, so he'd drive a new car. Well, if you bought a new Model T, that didn't do any good because the new Model T looked just like the old Model T. What Sloan came up with was the idea of the annual model change, the annual style change, where the 1923 Buick, one of General Motors' fleet, looked different from the 1922 Buick. It simply looked different. It didn't have to be any different under the hood. Now, it is true that Sloan at General Motors, like Henry Ford at Ford, would incorporate mechanical improvements, but what Sloan understood was that the whole point of the change was the change itself, so that you could be different. So when you drive down the street in your 1929 Oldsmobile, people would know that that's the latest model, not last year or the year before. And so Sloan was the one who introduced these annual model changes, which became, over the course of the 20th century and remain in the early 21st century, a really big deal. Now, in fact, his sales force couldn't wait for the beginning of the new year. Autumn was always a slow time in selling cars. So the dealers were the ones who said, I know, why don't we bring out the 1933 GM cars in September of 1932? Sloan said, sure, why not? And that's why, for example, even today, you can buy the 2004 automobiles in the summer of 2003. It seems to get earlier and earlier all the time. It was Sloan's insight that cars were more than just a utilitarian device. They were a statement of a person's identity, a statement of a person's success. Sloan pioneered many of the other innovations that became identified with the automobile industry. It was Sloan who first sold cars primarily on credit. He created the General Motors Acceptance Corporation. This is the agency that allows you to walk into a GM dealer and say, I want to buy a car, and they send you to the next desk over, and they lend you the money to buy the car. It was Sloan who pioneered the idea of the trade-in. Okay, you've got that old car, trade it in on a new car. We'll take your old car off your hands. There were a lot of people who couldn't figure out what to do with the old car, and Ford didn't want to take in the old car. But if you went to GM, General Motors would take in your old car and give you credit toward your new car. And it was Sloan at General Motors who pioneered the notion that individuals could move up from one model to the next. As long as the Model T was the only one around, you couldn't show that you were getting ahead if you purchased a Ford. But with General Motors had several lines. And as one industry analyst in the late 1920s put it, with General Motors, the way you go is this, and I quote, Chevrolet for the hoi polloi, Oakland, which later became Pontiac, for the poor but proud, Oldsmobile for the comfortable but discreet, Buick for the striving. I should tell this to my father. He's driven Buicks all his life. And Cadillac for the rich. And this was the idea that with the family of GM cars, you could go from the very beginning to the Ni Plus Ultra. You could drive the fanciest car in America, a Cadillac. And it was no coincidence that for many years, Cadillac was the aspiration of everybody who was trying to make it big in America. By the 1930s, General Motors had surpassed Ford as the leading automobile manufacturer. Ford wasn't quite driven out of business, but on a number of occasions, Ford was really on the rocks economically. Ford still survived. General Motors, of course, is still around. The lesson of all of this, I suppose, is partly the lesson that, yes, revolutions do tend to devour their young, or maybe it's a particular embodiment in this industry of a principle that's associated with the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who talked about the creative destruction of capitalism. We've seen this in other contexts in earlier lectures, but it's really clear in the case of the automobile industry, where Ford pioneers this notion of a car for the masses and succeeds brilliantly, but then he's bypassed as the revolution moves on. Ford Motor Company wasn't quite destroyed. It's still around. In fact, it's celebrating in the year 2000 its centennial. But it's quite clear that things have moved on past Ford. Interestingly, General Motors was for many years the largest corporation in the world, but GM has been bypassed by many foreign manufacturers, so that the American market is no longer the plaything, the backyard of General Motors. Things move on, and if you want to be a success in business, you have to move on with them. Well, so much for Ford and Alfred P. Sloan. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about something that really is characteristically in the 20th century, in the same way that automobiles, and that is the career of Walt Disney.
After listening to Lecture 7, a student posed this question to Professor Brands. Why was the automobile industry located in Detroit? Let's listen to the professor's response.
The reason the automobile industry was located in Detroit, primarily, the American automobile industry, was partly a matter of, well, that's near where Henry Ford lived. But also, it's at a place where it's really easy to get the raw materials together. So it has lake frontage, it's on the Great Lakes, and so you can ship in the steel that's necessary. You can bring that from Pittsburgh. You can bring in the rubber via the Erie Canal until they start making synthetic rubber. You can bring in the oil and that sort of stuff from western Pennsylvania. In time, Henry Ford made his own steel, so he was getting the iron ore from the region of Lake Superior. So Detroit is a wonderful place for bringing in heavy raw materials by water. They're not coming in by railroad. Most of them are coming in by water. And this gets back to the question we were talking about earlier regarding why cities are located where they're located. But some of it was simply happenstance. It's not the only place in the country where you could have done this. But so it was a coincidence, partly of the personalities and where they lived, but it became very convenient to build there. And once a particular expertise surrounding the automobile industry had developed, then new entrants into the automobile industry would want to be located there because that's where the industry engineers were located, that's where the workers were located, and so on. So it's partly accidental, it's partly because of its geographic location.